It feels like we have been waiting a very long time for this Olympic and Paralympic Games to actually begin. I know it's only been 3 years, but it's like the only time I ever focus on sport, so it feels like a lifetime. But this week, the Paris Olympics finally begin.
Yeah, and I think that's a sentiment a lot of people can relate to who might not love sport, but love the Olympics. So there were plenty of headlines in the lead up to the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, which were famously delayed until 2021 thanks to the pandemic. But the Paris Olympics have had their fair share of headlines too in the lead up to this week's opening ceremony.
And so I think that, you know, for a viewer or certainly someone that's not competing, it's like you turn on the TV, you get excited, you watch it, and then it ends. Obviously, in real life, it has a lot more of a tale than that. It's a very long process to get to the Olympics, and at least for the host nation to get to the Olympics. Where did this Olympic journey start for Paris?
Well, like any country who wants to host the Olympics and the Paralympics, the conversation begins many, many, many years before the Games themselves. France formally put forward itself as a candidate to host 2024 in 2016.
Okay.
So presumably conversations were had in the years leading up to that point. They put a formal bid in and France won that bid in September 2017 at the same time that LA was named as host for the 2028 Games.
And presumably the logic behind giving such a long kind of lead-in period is because of how long it takes to prepare for an Olympic Games, right?
Exactly. And there is a lot to prepare for. From a financial and infrastructure standpoint alone, there is so much to do. Cities have to transform themselves to accommodate all the events in appropriate stadiums and sporting facilities. Plus, we've got the Olympic Village where athletes are housed during the Games. Plus, transport infrastructure has to be managed to deal with the influx of spectators. We've got safety and security expenses. Whether or not a city actually has these requirements already or has the capacity to build these requirements or to meet these requirements is a major consideration for the committee who decides who gets to host. So the International Olympic Committee, before they say, yep, Paris, you've got the Games, they look at the kind of structure set up within a city already and its capacity to meet the demands of hosting.
It all sounds very expensive, you know, when you're talking about having to build this infrastructure from scratch in some scenarios. And it really reminds me of when we were talking about Victoria pulling out of the 2026 Commonwealth Games. That was, of course, announced by former Premier Daniel Andrews around this time last year.
$6 to $7 billion is well and truly too much for a 12-day sporting event. I will not take money out of hospitals and schools in order to fund an event that is 3 times the cost as estimated and budgeted for last year.
The Commonwealth Games is a smaller version of the Olympic Games. So what do we know about how much hosting the Olympics and the Paralympics costs?
As you mentioned with that Com Games example, the financial burden of hosting these sorts of global sporting events is really being discussed more and more. And of course, the Com Games are a smaller event. But that decision by Dan Andrews and Victoria to pull out of hosting actually inspired a study into this exact matter.
Interesting.
Oxford University published these findings in May, and they said the Tokyo Olympics, just the Olympics, not even the Paralympics, cost around 20 billion Australian dollars.
Just a drop in the ocean
Just a drop in the ocean. And researchers really wanted to investigate this financial spend and the financial risk of these mega sporting events. It noted that the last 3 summer games overran budgets by 185%. Now, that's not even including road, rail, airport, hotel and other infrastructure. And those factors can often cost more than the games themselves, these researchers found. And this is not a new problem. When we look back over the decades, the Canadian city of Montreal hosted the Summer Games in 1976 and took 30 years to pay off their stadium. Some of our listeners might remember headlines from the Rio Olympic Games.
I was going to say that's the one that I remember.
Yeah, that was the first time that it really stood out to me, kind of the scale of the burden on these cities to get ready. And yeah, you might remember vision of stadiums that were half built or not yet ready or didn't have proper electricity or plumbing before, you know, weeks out from the games. So there is a lot of pressure on these cities.
There's a lot of pressure, but presumably the upside is, of course, all of the tourism that comes to that city for the 3 weeks of the Olympics and then the Paralympics.
Yeah.
But balancing that and understanding at the end whether it is a net positive or a net negative is obviously something that needs to be weighed up. I want to go back to Paris specifically, though, because I think this is a really unusual Games in that it's happening against a fair bit of political uncertainty. You and I have spoken about this on the pod before, but can you just at a very high level tell us about the context in France right now?
Yeah, so these Games come at a time of huge political uncertainty after a recent election in France, which is also managing a Summer Games set during, record high temperatures and controversy in the headlines relating to this project to clean up the River Seine. There's a lot going on in the city of Paris at the moment. So a quick refresher on that political uncertainty. There was an election. The left-wing coalition that was formed during that election won the most votes, but the election resulted in a hung parliament. So we had a kind of even split between the left, the centre and the far-right alliances. It wasn't a presidential election, so Emmanuel Macron's job is safe, but this divided result really means that there is no clear majority winner and negotiations are still continuing between the parties as to what the future government of France is going to look like. Most recently, we saw a deal between Macron's party and a right-wing opposition party, but who ends up controlling the government, like I said, is still a far way from being determined.
And I remember when we spoke about the election results, we spoke about the fact that the French PM, Gabriel Attal, had handed or offered his resignation, but that there was a chance he would stay on because of the Olympics. What's happened there?
Yep. So he did resign as PM in the wake of the elections. He's part of Macron's ensemble party. But Attal suggested that he could remain in office throughout the Paris Olympic and Paralympic Games to maintain government. And we ended up seeing President Macron ask him to do just that. So Attal has stuck around. He's going to handle day-to-day business until the new government is named, according to French officials. And there will be voters who interpret this as, a show of stability for the nation while it's under such an intense spotlight with the Games in Paris.
Okay, so I think that gives us a bit of insight into the political context in which these games are playing out. But you also mentioned a few other very, very specific Paris concerns, like the River Seine. This is a strange one, and I must say, I think I missed the beginning of this story, or I came in late, or everyone knew about this but me. What is happening here?
Look, in order to answer the question, is Paris ready to host the Olympics? We have to address another concern, which is why have people been threatening to shit in the Seine?
No one can ever accuse us of not doing both highbrow and lowbrow content on this podcast.
Yep.
Very important question to investigate.
Investigating the important matters here at the Daily Aus. So one of the biggest challenges that Paris has faced in the lead up to the Olympics has been all about cleaning up the River Seine. So this is the river that runs right through the heart of Paris, out to the sea. If you've ever been to Paris, you can't miss it.
You know how feral it looks.
It doesn't look great. The river has been scheduled to stage some open water swimming events for the Olympics. So that means people competing in the water, as well as being the site of the official opening ceremony. So that takes place Friday night, local time, Saturday morning, very, very early for us here in Australia. But that's all going to be set along the Seine, and athletes will be on barges and boats going down the river. So the problem with the Seine in the lead up to this point is about pollution.
Yeah.
So it's been illegal to swim in the Seine for just over a century because of this pollution concern. But when Paris was announced as the host of the Olympics, the government committed 1.4 billion euros, or just over 2.2 billion Australian dollars, to clean it up in time for the Games.
That is no small task. As I said, if you've seen it, you understand what we're dealing with here and have a bit of a visual cue. The big question, of course, is it ready?
So bacterial tests from as recently as June found traces of E. coli, which rattled a lot of people and athletes and commentators and critics of this big cleanup project. Essentially, the findings showed the river was still too polluted to host swimming events, but an official in Paris acknowledged that it wasn't up to par. They blamed recent heavy rain on impacting the results, maybe skewing the data. But a group of fed-up local residents planned a protest against the public money that was being spent on this cleanup. They said that that money could have been better spent on easing cost of living pressures, on social issues. And when these findings of E. coli came out of that test in June, they said, nope, we've had enough. We're going to protest in the form of defecating in the river. Those plans ended up...
I think this is where I came into the story with zero context.
A lot of people probably came in at that point. That's the context. Those plans ended up being stalled, and it seems like protesters have eased off on that threat, to the relief of many, I'm sure.
And then last week we had the mayor of Paris swimming in it.
Yeah. So in an effort to convince locals, to convince Olympians and the world really, we saw the mayor of Paris swim in the Seine herself last week. Mayor Anne Hidalgo pledged that it would be safe to swim in for the Olympics, and she put her money where her mouth was and she jumped on in. She tried to prove that point. I haven't heard any news of her getting sick from that swim. She did look pretty happy while she was prancing around in the Seine. So for all intents and purposes, it's clean.
We've just received a very clear scientific analysis from Emma Gillespie here at the Daily Aus. The Seine is clean. You have nothing to worry about. So I want to keep moving on because, as we've already touched on, there are a couple of elements to this question of whether or not Paris is ready for the Games. You know, on the one hand, we've got the political context. On another, we've got, you know, the River Seine. But then there's also another element that I've started to see getting a lot of coverage recently, which is about security and safety. You know, obviously the Olympics and the Paralympics are these huge moments of people gathering. And so is Paris prepared in that respect?
Yeah, there's been a lot of international attention on this factor in particular. When we look at the kind of local response in Paris from police, there's been a crackdown on local crime in recent months. That's really been about trying to sort of clean up areas of Paris that will be on display for certain events, because there are going to be events right around the city, not just in the middle of the CBD. But that's actually been attributed to causing overcrowding in Paris prisons. So there's a whole set of social issues from that crackdown. In terms of security more broadly, and when we're talking about the threat of terrorism, obviously there are safety concerns with any international event of this nature, but there are some sort of standout quirks to the Paris Games in particular that will require extra security. So that includes, you know, this opening ceremony that we've touched on. It's going to be outdoors. An Olympic opening ceremony has never been held outdoors.
Wow.
So that's unprecedented. And there's also a bunch of stadiums that have popped up as kind of temporary venues. A lot of them are open air. They're being built around the city. And because of their temporary nature, their kind of security capacity is a little bit untested. So there is some concern around, you know, the pressure that they will place on officials to keep everyone safe. The president of the Paris 2024 Organising Committee said that every moment of the Games, right from the opening ceremony to all the competitions, has a, quote, specific plan to guarantee the security for all the accredited persons and the spectators. We can absolutely guarantee that security was the priority for Paris 2024, and from this base, we will build the concept of celebration. So there's also an exclusion zone around the Seine. Anyone in that zone needs to be properly accredited and be able to show accreditation. We can also expect to see international security from competing countries. They will often bring their own security, and there'll be a ramped up presence of security at places like local train stations and on the streets. In terms of numbers, to give you a sense of the scale, we're talking about around 55,000 soldiers, police, other law enforcement and military personnel during the Games in Paris. 55,000 sounds like a lot, but when you factor in that they'll be tasked with keeping more than 10,000 athletes and millions of spectators safe, you know, it's no small job.
And before we wrap up, I have been reading a lot of headlines about record heat waves in Europe. And of course, the Paris Games are being held kind of in the heat of summer. Is that something that's a concern for these Olympic Games?
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's a growing concern for the Summer Olympics as a concept more broadly. There is a new report that actually flagged these Games, the Olympics and Paralympics, could be the hottest in history. That's after record high temperatures in Tokyo at the last Games. And these findings came from an Australian athlete-led conservation group called Frontrunners and the British Association for Sustainable Sport. So that report warned that athletes in these conditions, in high heat, risk cramping, exhaustion, injury, heat stroke, disruption to their sleep patterns that could affect their ability to compete. And, you know, in the worst case scenario, even the risk of death from competing in severe heat. So temperatures in Paris at this time of year are forecasted to reach or exceed the mid-30s, and the Paralympics, which are set for the beginning of September, you know, that might sound like it's out of the summer period, but it could very well also be affected, given what this report described as the past precedent for heat waves to hit France later in the summer. Athletes have also raised concerns about a lack of air conditioning in the Olympic Village. This story made headlines a little while ago, but organisers actually ended up backflipping on that. So after this sort of initial plan of a really sustainable athletes' village that would not have air conditioning, news dropped earlier this month that 2,500 temporary cooling units would be installed. So I'm sure a lot of athletes relieved about that. In a press conference this week, the IOC president Thomas Bach said the Games would still be, quote, more sustainable than ever.
Paris is ready, France is ready, and we all can prepare for a spectacular Olympic Games here in Paris.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Daily Aus. If you want more news and updates from Paris, sign up to our daily sport newsletter. We will throw the link in today's show notes. Over the Olympics, it's going to be a 7 days a week update on everything you need to know, written by one of our incredible journos, and you'd be silly to miss it. Sign up via the link in our bio, and we'll see you again tomorrow.